Welcome, everyone. We welcome you today, even though we are all facing this lovely storm that's going to be coming in to Florida IPDay's Webinar Wednesday. Read like a historian, differentiating instruction because one size doesn't fit all. Today I'm joined by Susan Pittman. June Rawl is not with us today, but she sends her best as we get going on our latest webinar. So, Susan, let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, we want to make sure that everyone knows the basics since we're starting to use a new system this year for our webinars. If you have a question as we go through this webinar, if you will, please type it into the Q&A session because your attendee microphones are muted, so you're only in listen-only mode. Although we are talking and getting your reactions, again, we want as much and as many questions as you have into our Q&A. Know that today's presentation is being recorded. Like all other Webinar Wednesdays, it's going to be archived and it'll be available for you on the IPDay website within 48 hours. So Susan, what are we going to do today?
Well, we're going to do some things today that I truly enjoy. As a history major, I love all this stuff. So we're going to do some things with primary and secondary sources. And we're going to look at a reading strategy called Reading Like a Historian, which kind of puts students in a different mode as they start to read historical material. And of course, it wouldn't be one of these webinars if we didn't have a lot of resources and ideas to share with you. So, Bonnie, let's get started, and let's start by defining what's a primary source.
Susan, I think a primary source is anything that isn't a secondary source. Am I not correct there?
Well, that's one way to put it, but
okay.
Let's put it another way. So if we want to take that, quote, textbook out of the mix, because that's a secondary source, let's look at all these possibilities here for primary sources. I mean, we have, of course, one we always think of, the Declaration of Independence, or maybe the U.S. Constitution. But you know, there's a lot more, Bonnie, than just having those historical documents, the founding documents that we have. It could be a speech. Quite honestly, it could also be an autobiography. Notice I didn't say a biography. I was talking about an autobiography where Benjamin Franklin is talking about himself and what happened, you know, first person. But also take a look at those photographs. I mean, we have two photographs down at the bottom where you have Dr. King who's doing the I Have a Dream speech, but you also have an interview that's going on with President Obama. You also have the photograph of the child and his mother. When you look at that and you think, my gosh, how desperate the situations were back at that time. You have a firsthand look at what was happening at a given point in time. And who can ever forget the Diary of Anne Frank and all of the things that she included in there that gives us that insight into what the world was like at that point in time. Just keep in mind that primary sources really are those things that reflect first person, or that first person account of what's going on. It was done at that point in time, not at a later point when you're looking back, but it's actually real things that we can see from that point. So Bonnie, you want to do a little look-see and see which is a primary source and which isn't?
Are you telling me that you're going to test me?
Yes, I am. So
okay.
Tell me, Bonnie, if you were looking at Lewis and Clark's journals made during their exploration of the Western U.S., would you say that's a primary or secondary source?
I think it's a primary source because they wrote their journals as they were exploring. So it is first person and it happened at the time.
Absolutely. All right. So that's one. Let's try another one. See if you can do this one. How about your social studies textbook?
Well, I know that's secondary because you already told me that.
See, I'm so glad that your memory is popping in really well today. So
what can I say?
Well, you know, you just never know. But tell me, if you saw a photograph of Abraham Lincoln?
That's definitely a primary. Now, if it were a painting that someone did 100 years later, I'd know that was secondary. But a photograph, actual time, so definitely primary.
All right, let's try another one. Oh, historical fiction. A historical fiction play about the Boston Tea Party.
Well, first of all, it's fiction. It's a play. And even though it has that lovely thing called historical in it, that's definitely secondary. It didn't happen at the time, and someone wrote about something.
So, would you say that the play on Broadway, Hamilton, is secondary as well?
Oh, definitely, but a great resource to use and so much fun to watch.
Absolutely. All right, let's look at another one. And that's a recording that was made of Martin Luther King Jr. when he was delivering the I Have a Dream speech.
You know, that's definitely primary because it's a recording of Dr. King doing the speech as opposed to, oh, I can think a little later on today, we're going to have a recording of a speech by Abraham Lincoln, but it's not actually Lincoln giving the speech. It's a modern person by the name of Jeff Daniels who does it. But this is primary.
Okay, then how about that letter that all those soldiers sent home describing World War II?
You know, I don't know that our students always realize that letters from people, you don't have to be a famous person, really is a primary source.
Okay, well, we got one more, actually two more to go. So let's see how you do this one. How about that painting of what a cowboy's life was probably like?
You know, since the cowboy didn't paint it, that's definitely secondary source, what someone thought it was like.
Okay, and last but not least, how about this is pretty apropos. A friend describing a storm he was in last year.
Well, you know, this was written before we knew the storm was coming through. But again, it is an example of a primary source, someone writing about something that was happening. So again, that person who experienced it. You know, this is a great activity to do with your students where you do provide them with different types of resources so they can identify them, whether they're primary or secondary, and just as importantly, why. But you know, Susan, why, to quote a famous person, is it even important to teach primary sources?
Well, we have a couple of different things here. And so, let's kind of think about if we use those primary sources, what it helps us do is it helps us kind of change our students into the historian. It gives them a chance to glimpse what was happening at that point. It really does, if you think about it, it prompts them to start thinking and questioning certain things of why. I mean, if you go back and you take a look at that photo that we had earlier, then of the during the Dust Bowl and during the Great Depression, that would begin to why did that happen? What else was going on at that time? How did these people live? And that's a part of what we want to do with students. The other thing is we really want them to see how things connect the past to the present. I mean, we can certainly, if we look back again to that photograph, we can compare that to things that are happening in other countries at this point in time. If you think about where you have some of the ravages, I'll even go with Haiti at this point, where there's so many things where the ground and everything, has been deforested and all of the things that happen now, especially because of the storm coming through, and that just sheer devastation that's going on at that point. But the other thing is it really does encourage us to think at a higher order because we have to use those analysis and synthesis and evaluation skills as we're moving through. And last but not least, it really does. Its primary source can give us multiple perspectives because we could take multiple things from a given point in time and look at the perspectives that were coming in. I mean, let's face it, the British had quite a different perspective on the American Revolution and what was happening as opposed to the colonists. And so you get that view of looking at things a point in time, but from different areas, because there's always more than one part to that story itself. And the other thing, Bonnie, is that we really have to look at these as that this is an integral part of the GED social studies test, where students really do have to come in and they've got to be able to determine central ideas or information and from a specific source. We want them to see that from primary or secondary, they've got to be able to glean that information, extract those central ideas so that they can come to some conclusions based on the evidence that's supporting that or that's provided within it. And, Bonnie, we're talking evidence, and I know everybody says, oh, well, we got to forget about that because, evidence, we don't have to do that anymore. That was when they were writing social studies. No, evidence is something whenever we go to answer any question that's out there, it's what evidence points us into that direction itself.
And I'm sure everyone does notice that there is a workbook page. Both this PowerPoint and the workbook, which we're going to review in a little bit, are going to be available. And you should have received some of that information prior to working with this. But one of the things that we already have in the chat box I'd like to share, Susan, is Reed Dixon said, I love the premise of helping students identify as historians, engage in historical inquiry, connecting the past and present. And building on this discussion about primary versus secondary, it can be helpful to have students compare two snippets of contrasting secondary source accounts to analyze content, craft, history, and write their own versions based on their research. Do you recommend any resources for finding contrasting secondary source historical accounts? And Reed, stay tuned, because not only are we going to talk more about that, but in this webinar, we're going to differentiate instruction, showing you how not only is this important at the GED level, but how can we differentiate the same basic strategy for lower levels? And again, comparing, contrasting, because there's many perspectives or points of view of different historic events. So Reed, thank you so much for that sharing. It was very, very pertinent to what we were talking about.
Okay, Bonnie, so let's take a look if we can here. Because we've got to also, and again, coming back to Reed's just comment a minute ago, analyze how historical context shapes that author's point of view. People who were living at a certain time, a point in time, they had a point of view based on what all was happening around them and how they perceived those things. We still do that today in today's context, where we live, the people that we interact with, all of those things have an impact on that. So we need to help students understand how things were relevant to a specific text based on the events or things that were going on within that. So a lot of different information that we can use, and primary sources are such a wonderful and really interesting way to look at that. So Bonnie, we're going to look at how we can get started with helping teach students to read like a historian, because I think this process, which comes out of the Stanford History Education Group, is an excellent one, because it does allow some very specific things that you do as part of the process. So let's look at the process itself and how we can integrate primary sources. So first things first, we always have to go back and say, okay, I need a primary document. What is it I should be using? And because we're going to put some depth into this, we want to make sure that it's complex, it's content rich, meaning there are different concepts that I could pull from this information, that there is a lot of there's a lot of stuff to what I'm reading. It is really complex. But I want it to be short. I don't want something where I'm going to have to go through and have students that are reading pages and pages. Rather, I want them to be able to take and understand something, an excerpt from something, but something that gives the heart of that document itself. Now, from there, we're going to really look at researching that historical context of that particular document. How did it come into being? What was happening at that particular point in time? From there, we're going to take a look and we're going to talk about selecting that strategy for close reading, or in this case, that reading like a historian that we're going to do. And then from there, as a teacher, I need to create my lesson around that. And that means I need to give a little thought to it in terms of what is it that I want students to have as a takeaway from what they're doing. I know that there's specific things that I want them to learn. You know, Bonnie, we talked before, and I think on the next slide, we have one of those things that really deals with that enduring issues. And so if we take a look at something like this, then we want to make sure that from the heart of this, our students really are understanding, what does this mean as we're looking at this, establishing this Constitution for the United States of America. So I need to ask you a question, Bonnie. Would you have students read that entire document?
If you're talking about the entire Constitution, I think they'd walk out the door on me as soon as I said they had to read more than one page.
Probably so. In fact, it can be a little bit difficult to get them past that little preamble at the beginning. But would you have students read an excerpt that focuses on a specific concept or idea in it?
You know, yes, I would, because if we think about the enduring issues that the GED test continues to cover, I can cover those by specific excerpts, such as the First Amendment for individual rights versus the good of the community. You know, when I look at some of those amendments, I look at the separation of powers throughout the different articles. The different articles also provide me checks and balances. And I believe that last item in the Bill of Rights dealt with states' rights versus federal powers. Big ideas that our students have to have, but big ideas that they can get from excerpts that we as teachers can identify and share with students and really read deeply into them. And you know, one of the things I was thinking as Reed was talking is sometimes that compare and contrast of even concepts. Many of our students don't always realize there is a difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. What a wonderful way to teach compare contrast by having two short excerpts.
Absolutely. And the other thing is to get students to understand that when we talk about these as enduring issues, they are things that we struggle with today, that we have questions and we resolve things over time, and they're almost kind of not finished. They continue to grow and evolve as times change and as the different things are going on. And I'll take for an example there, just looking at states' rights versus federal power, and that attention today to that separation between those. What rights do states have, and does the federal government try to encroach on some of those rights? And it's always that struggle to make sure that we're living true to what that Constitution has laid out for us. So let's take a look at a couple of other possibilities, Bonnie.
You know, and that's true. As we look at primary sources, we need to also look at our students and determine, dependent upon the level of our students, because most of us teach in a multi-level classroom. We may have ABE and GED prep. In fact, we may even have ESOL, ABE and GED prep. And all of our students need to know about civics and government. It is not just a GED prep skill. So as I look at my students, I need to determine initially, would my students, or would I rather have those students read the Gettysburg Address? Or would I rather have my students listen to a recording first? Because of myself, it's so much better to listen initially because I'm auditory. Or would I like to add pictures of that actual event because that would really hook them? Or maybe I'd rather have students study a timeline of the Civil War and how the Gettysburg Address was part of that, a really important part. Or, you know, maybe because there were different perspectives, I might like to have students read responses from citizens to the Gettysburg Address. This is called differentiation. And I think sometimes we think that word differentiation is that magical word or the word of the day, but all of us should be differentiating all the time because we have students at such different levels. And so when we look at that differentiated classroom, I like Nancy Anderson's quote, it should feel like a community. It shouldn't be like we're in 3 different classrooms. So as Susan was talking earlier about those enduring issues, we should be able to, and not just should be able, but should differentiate those items because some of that is teacher dependent. When I'm looking at my approach, I'm going to look at content, the what of the lesson I'm developing. I'm going to look at the process. How am I going to teach this? If I'm teaching the Gettysburg Address, how am I going to teach it? What kinds of different materials or resources am I going to use? And what kind of product do I want from students? You know, at an upper level of skill, maybe I want some larger writing sample. Maybe at the lower readability, I want a poster or I want a short verbal speech, lots of different things. That's what we call teacher dependence in differentiation.
Bonnie, I'm going to interrupt you for just a minute because we have a question from John who says, if we just use specific excerpts, aren't we influencing students' opinions by what we select for them to read?
You know, that's an interesting thing to ask, and not necessarily if a couple things happen. First of all, as you noticed as we were looking earlier at what would I like my students to, we need to make sure that we do have different ways that we're teaching that excerpt. But there again, if we're looking at the Constitution and we're looking at some of those phrases, let's face it, the First Amendment is about individual rights. We're not swaying our students to understand that that is in the Constitution. It is there. If I am, as a primary source, only giving an editorial cartoon on one side and saying that is the correct way to view history, you're exactly right. I am then swaying them. So it really depends upon two things. Number one is, of course, the primary sources that we select, the excerpts. But number two, and we'll talk more about this as we talk about reading like a historian, is that corroboration. What else was going on at the time? What other resources, what other primary sources were out there that either support or refute what is being said? So really good comment. I think, Susan, we need to come back to that as we're talking about read like a historian, so all of us realize that for everything that gets said historically, there are at least two sides.
Okay, sounds good to me. Because I think we can easily do that. But then, Bonnie, you said you're talking about what was teacher dependent. We have another thing over here, and it's dependent on the learner. And,
you know, it is.
That's one of those things where we have to take into consideration some of their interest, because for many students, you know, I'm not sure that we always ask them what their interest is at certain points, and especially when it involves social studies or something in history. Just face it, you know, back to our own history classes, we pretty much had everything just dealt out as a certain time chronology of events that occurred, rather than having that opportunity to really focus in on things that might be of interest. But we also have to look at a student's individual educational profile. Where are some strengths and weaknesses that they have, and how can we make sure that that lesson helps address some of those? But also, are they ready? Do they have a level of readiness for working with that concept or working with those materials? And of course, as always, we have the student diversity, where we're looking across generational differences and learning styles and cultural differences, and think of all the diverse backgrounds of the students that we serve. So there's a lot to keep in mind, but we have to keep in mind looking at both sides so that we make sure that that lesson that we've developed really is going to address the things that our students really need.
So, Susan, there are concerns when reading primary sources, as we all know, and we're going to talk about a process called reading like a historian. You will have this particular URL on the PowerPoint that you downloaded for this, and we'd strongly recommend that. Yes, it is a 912 video, but it does a great job of showing us what this process looks like, called reading like a historian. But for today, we're going to take you through just a short overview of how do you teach this process called reading like a historian. And we nicely say it has 3 C's and an S. Because when I'm doing this close reading process, I want to make sure that my students indeed understand the source, a fancy word for pre-reading, that they are able to contextualize, basically understanding what it was like. Of course, as we talked about it before, corroboration. Does this work well? Saying what other documents say. And then last but not least, closely reading. So Susan, take us through that process. What in the world is sourcing? I said it was before reading, but that doesn't make sense.
Well, it does make sense if we take it just a little bit beyond that, because it's about not just being familiar with what the document is saying, but it's about almost getting a mindset, so that your brain cells, all those synapses in there, are beginning to work in a way that our focus is coming into this document. And this is a way to do it. So we're first going to look at who authored that document. And with that in mind, let's see what that author's point of view might be. And so in most of the cases where we're looking at these primary sources, we're looking at things if we look at something like the Gettysburg Address, and we know that it was done by Abraham Lincoln, then we also have an idea of his point of view in doing it. So why was it written? What was the occasion? What was going on, and when? The when is important because our students, let's face it, Bonnie, they look at anything that happened before 1990 as ancient history. I say it was just getting started, but they think that that was so long ago. And so we have to look at when was it written and try to get them to have an idea of how to put themselves back into that role. Where? Because different things coming from different places. And last but not least, it's like, is this source believable or not, and why or why not? So all of those things we try to do. Now, will we necessarily be able to answer every single one of these as we're doing that initial sourcing? Maybe not, but at the same time, we want to lay that groundwork as we're going through. So, Bonnie, let's just take a look at something here. And if we source this particular one, this particular document is in your workbook. It's on page 8, but just to kind of give you a little feel for it, okay, we've got our title up there called the Way Station. Well, that's not something I'm necessarily on an ongoing basis familiar with, but I can see that in that sourcing as I'm going through that I'm looking way back into the 1800s. And also with Mark Twain, the title of this particular thing that it comes from is called Roughing It. So if I take those things and I actually come back and I do that kind of previewing and just look underneath the title, each evening the stage announces its approach to a way station by the driver blowing a bugle. The way station offers sparse comfort. Okay, Mark Twain has already said roughing it, and it says something about the stagecoach, or the stage announces its approach. So, and it's from 1870. So, okay, I'm beginning to just get a feel. I haven't read anything in the document itself, but I'm beginning to understand where this is coming from and what's going on. It's just a connection that I'm beginning to make. And now, as I'm doing that, I have to look at it from a contextual, I have to put it into its context. And when I do that, I'm looking at things like, where and when was this document created? Okay, so I did that in sourcing. It's 1872, and they're talking about stages. So, if I go through and I just do a quick scan through these different things, I see that they're talking about adobes and the Spaniards and looking at weeds and grass, buildings of barns and stable room for 12 or 15 horses. I'm beginning to put that into context. Now, I have to also think, gosh, what would it have been like?
But Susan, before we talk about what it's been like, because we have a few questions, comments about the workbook, I'm just going to very quickly, to set people's mind at ease, pull up the workbook so that they know you had access to this workbook either when you registered, it was sent, or it is also on the Florida IPDAY website under archived webinars. However, just so that you know a little bit about what you're getting, you do have this workshop guide. And as you go through this guide, I'm just going to catch us up briefly to set everybody's mind at ease. You not only have some of the info that we talked about, but those questions on reading like a historian. And here you should actually see the article, the excerpt that Susan's talking about. All of the resources, and we will come back to this at the end, but all the resources that we're referencing in this webinar are in this, and again, it's available to you. If you were not able to download it before the webinar, it is on the Florida IPDAY website under the archived webinar of this title. Okay, Susan, sorry about the interruption, but you know what?
That's okay, because one of the comments that Reed made was just a minute ago was back to, and Bonnie, if you'll pull back to sourcing for just a minute, come back one slide, that really what we are trying to do is get that author's point of view. Where's the author coming from in doing this? I'll give you an example. If we were looking at Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, there's a point of view that he has taken as he's sitting there in jail writing that letter. And it's important that we understand his point of view, because somebody on the outside of that jail, somebody who's an onlooker, will see something that's very different and different points of view coming in. And then also why that particular thing was written. It wasn't just that Dr. King was getting bored sitting in the jail. It really was a question of what was he doing and what was he responding to? So those are things that are really important as we're going through. But let's keep going, and Bonnie, I'll have you go back over, and we're going to go over to contextualization, because I think that may help too as we look at everything. Because when we're looking at when and where the document was created, we begin to put it into a context of what other things were going on at that time. And in our minds, if we really want to get into this document, we need to look at what was it like to be alive at that point in time? What was different then? What was the same? You know, how might circumstances in which the document was created affect its content? Well, if we go back and we take a look at the way station itself, we begin to see some other things, and we can begin to put those into context. So what I will ask is that, Bonnie, as you move over to the next one, let's begin to put this into a little bit of context. Now, we talked about the station itself, and we were talking about, you know, how it was very sparse in comfort. Take a look on the fact, this is an example, a photograph, primary source, from that point in time. You look at the stagecoach, you look at people who are in the stagecoach, they're on top of the stage, you got stuff backed up on the bottom, all of that, and you look at where they're going and you think, oh my gosh, there's no road there. There's really no road. So I add to that, and I'm beginning to get a feel for, I'm glad I'm not riding in that stagecoach at this point in time. But I could add a little bit more, because the caption from this actually tells us a little bit about stagecoach. I know they could squeeze 18 to 20 passengers into it. I mean, think about it. You're sitting one on top of the other. You're going over not even a road. Come on. It's just rocky terrain as you're going through there. And I don't think they're really good springs on that. And we're making about 8 miles an hour. 8 miles an hour. Suppose that you had 700 miles to travel. The number of hours that you were going. And so when we go back and we take a look at the way station, the article itself that Mark Twain wrote, then we begin to see that how rough this was. No wonder he called this roughing it. You know, I mean, there were so many different things, because yes, there was a way station, and today we think of them as rest areas, but there was a whole different story from what we had at that particular point in time. But we can go further than that. That kind of gets them into what was it like to live then.
Susan, I can't go forward until I imagine 18 to 20 people in there, and I also know back in that time they did not take baths very often.
And especially if they were traveling in the summer.
Oh,
Yep.
you know, the visual is, and the auditory and the olfactory is more than I can handle, I think.
Absolutely. And so that's the kind of thing that we can do this in looking at that context. And Reed Dickinson has another comment. He says, I like the emphasis on context. Who takes on the cognitive work here to learn the context? In this particular case, what we're doing is we're trying to expose students to this. So this is where good old Google comes in so handy for those of us as we're working with these documents, that you as the instructor come back and say, I have a few things to go along with this. When Bonnie and I were working on pulling these pieces together, that's the very thing that we did. We thought, okay, for our students who are surrounded by images and media, we wanted to give them at least some ideas of something that they could relate to. That's why we brought in the photograph of the stagecoach itself, so that we could actually set that context of what this was like so they could relate to it. But we wanted to go a little bit further than that, because we also wanted to say, okay, what else was happening at that point in time? Well, it's the 1870s, and that's after the Civil War. So you had that period in Reconstruction afterwards. But there was another thing that was really going on within this country as well. And that particular thing, Bonnie, if you'll pull in that next image for me, really comes back to the United Procession of Women. And this is where we actually look and see, well, you know what? At the time this was being written, women were actually beginning that fight to get the right to vote. So we're talking back again about, look how we've tied those different things in. And, you know, students may not think that they did protest and they did marches way back then in the dark ages, but yes, they did. There were things that were going on at that point in time of getting, you know, awareness going, the suffragettes. So we put it into a context. Now, we just pulled an example of a text that that may not be something that you're interested in using, but we could do that very same thing around any number of ones. If we wanted to do the letter from the Birmingham jail, we could certainly use photographs of the time. We could have examples of what were some of the Jim Crow laws that were there that impacted people's right to vote. There's so many different possibilities, all tied back in to constitutional issues. We don't want, and one thing we want you to keep in mind is that we do not want to do lots of these. What we really want to do is help students to get that inquiring mind so that they learn a process, but then they're able to go out and replicate it and maybe begin to do more of that, that thinking and that inquiry on their own. But the main thing is for us to find some high value material that we can help them use and learn. Now, the other thing is that we got to do something else. And you know, I've yet to go through and do a close reading on what Mark Twain had to say. I skimmed through, I sourced it, I thought about how it was connected to some other things, but I've yet to get in there and do any close reading. But I've already got some ideas that are already percolating in my head, that are some questions that are going to be going through. So at this point is really where I dig in and I look at what Mark Twain in that particular article was actually saying. What claim is he making? What was the evidence that he used to support that? And Mark Twain being Mark Twain, what's the language like? What were the phrases and images or symbols that he used to inform people or persuade? And also you're looking at that from his own perspective. And I'm sure there's a lot of information that Mark Twain left out in going through and talking about the way station. But, you know, I want to know, how did that document make me feel? Did I get a better understanding of what it was like to travel cross country back in a time when we couldn't just go hop on a plane? Or when there was nothing like the highway system that's out there now, the interstate highway system. Lots of different things that I can do from this. And then last but not least, Bonnie said it earlier. Well, are there some other documents out there? Can this be corroborated? Do other documents agree, or did he just have kind of this out there position that he was taking? And again, this is where Google can come in handy, where you can look at some other things that were in place at that particular point in time. So we want to make sure that as we're looking at these, that students understand that it's not just about what one person has to say, but it's about how things work together and how that the connections that are there.
Okay,
And
Susan, I thought that was Benjamin Franklin that said that.
no, honey, I'm sorry. It was Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
But you know what? This is the thing that we have to be really cautious of students. Actually, we have to be really cautious of everybody, because it takes you just a moment to step back and say, whoa, 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 whoa. No, not right. But students do have a habit of looking at something and saying, oh, well, that has to be true because it was found on XYZ site. I saw it on Instagram. I saw it wherever. And the reality is that reading like a historian requires that we go more into depth. We don't take something at just its face value, but that we're looking more closely at it as we're working through. So Bonnie, let's pull up very quickly that the form that we have from Stanford History Education Group, because all of those questions that we just had are listed here, and this is in your workbook as well. But look at what it says under each one of those students should be able to do. And those are the kinds of things we want to work our students toward that. This is something that you do several high quality, content rich documents in order to work with them, primary sources. Then it's really about them gaining the strategy so that they could in turn use that strategy later on.
Okay, Susan, and for those of you who are with us, never fear, we will actually show you where you can download ready-made lesson plans that have this whole process, because Susan and I strongly believe, why recreate the wheel? However, we also know that in this multi-level classroom, we do need to differentiate, and sometimes that word, we get hung up a little bit. It's become the buzzword. But it really is just an approach that enables each of us to plan to meet the needs of every learner. So let's take reading like a historian and let's differentiate that process for an important man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Very important figure in our history. In fact, I'm sure if you asked your students, what do you know about Lincoln? They would give the typical, well, Susan, if I asked your students, what did they know about Lincoln? What would be some of their comments?
He wore one of those real tall hats.
Oh, he did. He did. And I don't know why, it just made him look taller. What else would they say?
Well, they probably could say he had something to do with some war that happened.
Ah, yes.
And they might also say something about, you know, he was also known as Honest Abe.
Ah, yes. I wonder why. Was he married?
Yes, in fact, he was. And there's some really interesting stories about his wife. But anyway, I digress.
Did he have children?
Yes, he did.
Was he a good father?
From all I heard, yes.
Okay, so we do have a real Abraham Lincoln. In fact, this is a great route to differentiate for all of your classroom. And it doesn't take a whole lot from you as an instructor, except as you're doing this process that you're aware that there are a lot of different documents out there about Lincoln. There's letters, not only the formal letters, but his love letters to his wife.
Uh-huh.
There's videos. Again, do we have an actual video of Lincoln? Not really. We've got a few tintypes, but they're not good. But we do have videos of other people doing his speeches. Of course, we have lots of quotes. And you know what? We have photographs and even artifacts of the time. Gosh, what kind of a source is an artifact?
Well, that's a primary source.
Oh, okay. Well, let's look at those in just a moment. And then you would need to provide a little bit of historical background on the selected document. But here's where students get to select. They get to buy in. You would have students select two of the documents that they choose to closely read. And then you'll notice that we have S plus 3C's S plus an E chart. More about that in a moment, because it does add an important aspect to the 3C's and an S. You would want students to discuss the historic perspective of Lincoln that they got from those two documents and share what they learned about the real Lincoln. So let's take a look at what we could do, because we know that some of our students learn best through listening. And you have a great speech here by a gentleman by the name of Jeff Daniels, who reads the Gettysburg Address. And I can't think of a more wonderful voice. So maybe students decide, you know what, I really like learning auditorily. So I'm going to listen to this great speech because it looks really, really hard to read. But as I listen to this voice, I get so much out of it about who Lincoln was and what his ideals were, what was important to him, how did he feel on this day, because you can just hear all of those emotions in this voice. But Susan, did you know that Lincoln actually wrote love letters, or at least letters to his wife? And when students take a look at a personal Lincoln, a letter to his wife, I think what they're going to find, like I found, was he was not exactly a warm, gushy man when he wrote letters. I mean, he may say most affectionately, or he may say dear wife or dear Mary, but then sometimes he would write something: in this troublesome world, we are never quite satisfied. When you were here, I thought you hindered me some in attending to business. But now, having nothing but business, no variety, it has grown exceedingly tasteless to me. You know, why didn't he just say, I really, really miss you? And, you know, I messed up in saying I needed to be alone. It would have been much easier. However, by reading it, you get a feel for the fact that even in his personal life, there was a formality to
Well,
Lincoln.
but you also have to think of it in terms of there was a formality at the time
That is true.
and an expectation at that point in time of how you would respond to things where other things might be seeming more less respectful. And so we look at that's why we go back and we take a look at the sentences and we look at the phrasing that's used and that formality as we move through. So you have to keep that in mind with the times and how things were different. If we were to compare this to some letters maybe from FDR to Eleanor, then you might find a little difference. Still a certain level of formality because of the way they wrote, but there would be changes because, you know, again, that's another 80 years into the 70 or so years into the future.
But you know, Susan, I could also give my students pictures of artifacts. Maybe I give them a picture of that top hat, or how they traveled, or a plowshare, or how they cooked, and that would require that maybe they research a little bit into even what those are, or gosh, the way that Mary Todd Lincoln dressed. I mean, I can't imagine, you know, all of those flowing gowns and how filthy they would have gotten, or how hard to get through doorways. Although that doesn't sound like much, for some of our students, that's the catch that they really love. And from that, you use a form similar to this, which again is in your workbook, where they answer the questions about each document. Who made the source? Where did it come from? They imagine the setting around the document, or how the world is different. They do the close reading and brief list. If you'll notice, we're not having them write much. Brief list. They do the corroboration. Does it tell them something new? I mean, you know, it told me something a little new about Lincoln if I look at, you know, the different things he wore, or even if I look at the different pictures of him, especially maybe the picture of him with his children. And finally, that we want students to evaluate, compare, contrast those two documents, or go ahead and determine did those two documents change their opinion of Lincoln? That's differentiation at a very easy level. But again, it provides our students with so much information about a very important person in our history. Now, we wouldn't have to do it about people. Again, as Susan said earlier, you could do it with other different types of primary sources, other big ideas. The bottom line is we want to be able to get historical readings into all levels of students' curriculum. And so that's where these types of things work very well. But as I'm sure all of you are aware, none of us have nearly enough time to do everything that we want to do. So Susan, let's take a quick review before we look at the workbook of a couple of websites that our participants may need to or may want to take a quick look at, because they provide so many great ideas as well as complete lesson plans.
Okay, and we will keep this very quick because I do know we have about 10 minutes more.
Yes.
So 50 core documents. And this one, again, teachingamericanhistory.org has wonderful documents, something that you can go through, take a look, download a copy of different things so that you have access to information that may be very useful to you. That next one, Teaching History Primary Source Sets. This one, again, comes out of that National History Education Clearinghouse. Wonderful lesson plans, primary source sets on the web. And that's something that Reed, I think you mentioned earlier today, is about having different sets of materials with which you could work. And so again, this would give you that opportunity. This is just a wonderful site. Take advantage of that, just viewing the site, getting a feel for the types of materials that are out there. The next one that we have is the digital reader. And you may have at some point in time taken a look at this, but this one really delves into history, looking at a revolution for whom, as you see from the screenshot that we have here, but also an opportunity to really look at different modules at different points in time in history. Now, this one happens to be one of my favorite sites, and again, you can't beat the National Archives for just the breadth and depth of material that they have. But docsteach.org, wonderful site to be able to pull, especially into the Constitution. And I think that as we talked earlier about that need for enduring issues, this becomes really a site that we can use quite frequently in order to do that. Don't forget the Annenberg Classroom. Just as we have talked in the past about having Annenberg having so many wonderful resources for math and science, they also have great civics education resources. And so this is another one where students can actually understand the court and what that's all about. Bonnie and I today, we focused on the Stanford History Education Group, Reading Like a Historian. I would advise you to go back, and that little video that Bonnie referenced earlier takes 10 minutes. But it does give you a great overview of the information that's there. A couple more, and we have Step into the Shoes of a History Detective. Yes, but again, this is another excellent site. This comes out of PBS, and a chance to go back and explore and look at what it does. It's tied right next to those different steps that you find in reading as a historian: sourcing, contextualizing, corroborating, and close reading.
If you liked the Lincoln lesson plan, that was adapted from here, so great resource.
And then one other thing, looking out at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and News, there is a section on that site called Live Binders, where you can pull case studies, you can pull information and full lessons that you can work with, and so much information here. They're the Center for History and New Media, so they have done a fantastic job of pulling into this whole idea of looking at historical thinking and investigation skills.
Okay, if you are new to adult ed or if you are new to IPDAY, please don't forget that there are great resources for social studies on the IPDAY website. There are lesson plans for social studies, all totally complete so that you just read and implement. There is an e-training or an e-learning module that deals with social studies, so please make sure that you sign up in your portal so that you receive even more types of activities, background knowledge, etc. Of course, the workshops and the webinars, the grab and goes, and even Florida's instructor handbook. But before we leave you today, we want just to tell you a little bit more about a couple things that are really, really important for all of you this fall. We are doing a regional GED preparation train the trainer workshop across 9 different areas. Please do not worry that it says train the trainer. The purpose of this is to build capacity in the areas of RLA and math. Many of you come to workshops knowing that you need to go back and share with your fellow teachers. So by registering for these, you will not only be able to get a lot of information coming to the workshops, but you will return with a scripted PowerPoint, all of the materials you need to share with your fellow teachers. And again, great area. IPDAY will also be doing more instructional workshops in the areas of ABE, ESOL, and differentiated instruction. And don't forget that this year in the GE learning module, so they will have science and math. But one of the most exciting things that we're seeing right now is the fact that if you've not been out to look at some of the new grab and goes, our webmaster and designer, Joseph Reed, has come up with a fantastic new format for that content. And then, of course, we will continue to have more information on Webinar Wednesdays. So, having said that, last but not least, let me just again show you that you do have in the archive a handbook called Reading Like a Historian with tools for the classroom with the materials that we referenced today. And when you go to the back, you will notice that, and I'm going to very quickly go through, and everybody will get a headache with me scrolling, is the last page will give you not only the URLs for the websites we talked about, but also a few extras here. So please know that all of these are free, but they also have excellent, excellent information. So, having said that, I know we have just a couple minutes more, Susan, so I'm going to ask any questions from the field.
Well, I would just say, Bonnie, that because I do know that people probably are getting ready to do their planning for the storm or wherever they may be, but take an opportunity to go through and look at a few of the things that we had here today. I think what you'll find is that there are some materials that you can go back into and use and work with the different students, and do this as across the board with our ABE and GED. Chris Martinelli, Bonnie has asked, how do you get to the archives from the IPDAY website?
And there are a number of ways that you can get in. You can get into the webinars either by area. So if you go into GED or ASC, that will click in to the archives. Or if you even just type in webinars, you will be taken to the archives as well. Or on that front page, if you'll go down, it also has a link for the webinars.
Okay, and then we have another one. Can we replay it? And yes, it will be in the archive, so you'll have a chance to go back and replay this particular webinar. Thank you for thinking of doing that, because I know sometimes we have questions that pop up as we kind of move on from there. From Chris, I have a question here, Bonnie. How important is exploring world history for the GED? And I'll take this just from my own opinion. When I take a look at the GED social studies test, the bulk of the test questions come from civics and government, with another portion from United States history. That's where the bulk of the test lies is within those two. So my opinion would be that you can do a little with world history, but I certainly wouldn't want to spend a lot of time in working with that. But I would look at it more in the perspective of what about the U.S. and its place in the world? And you could look at that from everything from looking at briefly at, conflict, which would be the different world wars that were out there. But again, I would keep it simple. Otherwise, there is just so much to cover. But the civics and government, U.S. history, let that be your primary focus.
And we did get asked, can you have credit for your teaching certificates? You will get a certificate of attendance for attending this webinar. It is up to your individual school districts, colleges, CBOs to approve it for the credit. But again, you will get a certificate of attendance. And last but not least, from Lynn, you made my day. Lynn said, our students and a coworker are tuning in along with me. Students especially appreciated the primary and secondary source information, and they answered correctly.
Yay!
Cody, and Cody stated, I learned not to trust all of Abraham Lincoln's quotes. So, I love it.
That's right. I will have one other thing, Bonnie, from Linda Richardson. She says, I'm new to this. Did I understand that there are webinars every Wednesday? And there may not be a webinar every Wednesday, but if you'll take a look on the Florida IPDay site under the calendar so that you can see the different webinars that are coming up. But what Florida IPDay has sought to do is provide webinars on Wednesdays so that teachers would know that, hey, it's Wednesday, there may be a webinar coming up, so let's take a look and see what we have. So hopefully that will help in being able to get you involved in more of these. So we're glad to have you with us. Thank you, Linda.
Okay, we do thank everyone for being with us today. So on behalf of June Rawl, Director of IPDay, Joseph Reed, our tech expert, Susan and myself, thank you so much for being here. Please make sure in this upcoming days that you stay safe, but also continue to stay connected with the IPDay team. So have a great rest of the day, and we will see you soon.